Vivian Whitmore had never once looked directly at the man kneeling beneath the wing of her private jet. To her, he was simply a rush-hired mechanic, oil on his sleeves, an old truck in the lot, a name not worth remembering. But when the billion-dollar aircraft refused to leave the ground before a meeting that could decide her company's future, Callan Brooks needed only 17 minutes to find the fault an entire engineering team had missed. Then a pilot license slipped from his jacket pocket onto the concrete. Vivian looked down at the certification code printed across it, and the color drained from her face. If you enjoy stories where a powerful executive underestimates the wrong person and gets humbled in the most satisfying way, hit subscribe now so you never miss how far this one goes. The desert around Black Mesa Executive Airfield shimmered under a punishing mid-morning sun, the kind of heat that made the tarmac ripple like water from a distance. Vivian Whitmore stood beside her private jet, tailored coat unwrinkled despite the wind, phone pressed to her ear as she confirmed the final details of a flight to New York that could not, under any circumstance, be delayed. The aircraft carried a tail number known throughout the industry, a symbol of the Whitmore family's decades in aviation, inherited from her father and now the flagship of a company she had spent years trying to prove she deserved to run. Everything about the morning had been planned to the minute, because the board meeting waiting for her in Manhattan would decide whether Whitmore Global Aviation kept its independence or was folded into a restructuring deal she had not yet agreed to sign. Then, without warning, the fuel monitoring system flagged an irregular pressure reading, and the cabin pressurization gauge blinked amber instead of green. The company's lead maintenance crew, the two engineers who normally handled anything involving that aircraft, were nowhere on the field, having been quietly redirected that morning by the company's chief operating officer, Dalton Blackwood, to inspect an unrelated hangar on the far side of the property. With the clock draining and no senior technician available, the airfield's operations manager made a desperate call to an independent contractor who occasionally picked up emergency shifts, a quiet man named Callan Brooks. Callan arrived in a faded pickup truck that looked entirely out of place among the polished vehicles lining the executive tarmac, wearing a jacket that had seen better winters and carrying a toolbox with a dented latch. Vivian watched him climb out, looked him over once, and asked coldly whether he was truly the best the airfield could produce on short notice. No one stepped in to defend him. A younger staff pilot standing nearby smirked openly when Callan chose to inspect the wiring by hand instead of immediately opening a diagnostic laptop, as if his methods belonged to another decade entirely. Vivian gave him a blunt ultimatum, telling him that if the aircraft was not airworthy within 30 minutes, she would have the airfield blacklisted and make certain he never worked another Whitmore contract again. Callan said nothing in response. He simply studied the instrument panel, asked a few precise questions about the last scheduled maintenance, and moved with a steadiness that seemed to irritate Vivian more than any excuse could have. His calm felt, to her, like insolence dressed up as competence, and she found herself wanting him to fail simply so she could be proven right about him. Callan worked methodically, tracing wires back from the cockpit panel to a junction box tucked behind an access plate that most technicians never bothered removing during a routine inspection. He noted the torque marks on each bolt and the faint scuff patterns around the housing, small details that told him someone had opened this panel recently and tried to make it look untouched. He pulled a flashlight from his toolbox, ran the beams slowly along a bundle of cables, and paused when he found one connector seated at a slightly wrong angle, as though it had been reattached in a hurry rather than fitted by a careful hand. None of it screamed sabotage on its own, but taken together, the pattern told a story that made his jaw tighten. By the end of that first hour, Callan had traced the fault not to the primary sensor everyone assumed was responsible, but to a secondary module that had been swapped for a part that did not match the manufacturer's specification. He said quietly, almost to himself, that an aircraft this well-maintained did not fail on its own, and that someone appeared to want this particular jet grounded on this particular morning. Vivian assumed he was inflating the problem to justify a higher invoice, unaware that the man she had just threatened had already spotted the first thread of a scheme worth far more than her entire flight budget. Convinced that the mechanic was exaggerating a minor issue to pad his fee, Vivian instructed her assistant to draw up a token payment voucher for exactly $1, framing it as compensation for services not yet proven worth anything more. The moment was engineered to sting, an executive worth hundreds of millions standing beside a private jet, extending a single-dollar receipt to a man on his knees beneath the landing gear. A security guard nearby chuckled under his breath at the sight. Vivian told Callan flatly that she paid fair value for confidence that had not yet been earned, and that today his confidence was worth exactly what she was offering him. Callan looked at the slip of paper for a long moment, showed no anger, signed his name, folded it once, and slid it into his jacket pocket without a word of protest. He returned to the open panel beneath the fuselage, pulled the secondary circuit board free, and began comparing serial numbers against a maintenance log open on his phone. What he found troubled him more than the faulty module itself. A component that had clearly been installed within the last 2 days carried paperwork claiming it had been in service for half a year, meaning someone had deliberately falsified the aircraft's maintenance history rather than simply making an honest mistake. While Callan worked, Dalton Blackwood called Vivian with a tone of practiced concern, mentioning almost casually that if she missed her window to New York, the board could invoke an emergency clause and install a temporary steward over daily operations. Vivian felt the pressure tighten in her chest, though she still refused to entertain the idea that a stranger in a mechanic's jacket could understand anything about the stakes involved. Callan overheard fragments of the call and asked, without looking up, whether today's flight needed to happen specifically to keep some contract from lapsing. Vivian turned on him sharply, telling him he was hired to fix an aircraft, not to diagnose her company's problems. Callan pressed further into the aircraft's data recorder and discovered something that made the falsified part look almost minor by comparison, evidence that the flight data logging system had been manually reset at some point in the recent past. Private jets of this caliber were built to retain a continuous history of every inspection, warning, and operational anomaly, which meant a manual reset was not a glitch, but a deliberate act of concealment. He asked to see the aircraft's physical logbook, the paper record kept separately from the digital systems as a backup against exactly this kind of tampering. Vivian's in-house counsel, Maren Lockridge, arrived just then and immediately blocked the request, informing him that a contractor had no standing to review proprietary corporate documents. Callan reached into his pocket and produced the $1 receipt Vivian herself had signed, pointing out that she had personally hired him to resolve a safety fault, which meant he had every right to review any documentation connected to that fault. Maren looked to Vivian for a ruling, and Vivian, aware that every minute of delay was costing her leverage with the board, reluctantly agreed. When Callan opened the logbook and ran his finger down the maintenance signatures, he stopped at an entry bearing an abbreviated name that matched his own initials, even though he had never signed anything in that book in his life. Someone, years earlier, had used his identity to authorize an inspection he had no memory of performing. He asked whether the aircraft had ever been tested at a facility called Cedar Falls Aviation Yard, and Vivian felt a small jolt of surprise, since that had been her father's private testing site, shuttered long before her father's death and rarely mentioned inside the company anymore. Dalton had told her years ago that every record from that facility had been destroyed in a warehouse fire, a story she had never had reason to question until now. Callan did not explain himself immediately, choosing instead to say only that if this particular signature had been used anywhere in today's paperwork, she was standing on top of a $99 million problem far larger than a broken sensor. For the first time since his arrival, Vivian felt something shift in her certainty, a suspicion that this quiet stranger somehow understood a piece of her father's history that she did not. With the delayed flight now threatening to unravel far more than a single meeting, Vivian was pulled into an emergency board session broadcast onto a large screen inside the hangar, standing in front of her own employees while directors questioned her competence in real time. Preston Kingsley, the company's most senior director, and a man who had never fully trusted her to run her father's company, led the interrogation, framing the grounded jet as proof that Whitmore Global Aviation's aircraft fleet was deteriorating under her leadership. Dalton Blackwood entered the hangar with the calm satisfaction of a man arriving exactly on schedule, announcing that he had already prepared a solution to save the company from embarrassment. His plan involved selling a significant stake of Whitmore Global Aviation to a rival investment fund run by a billionaire named Sterling Ashford, framed publicly as a partnership but structured, in reality, to hand over meaningful control. Vivian objected immediately, but Dalton produced a document explaining that if the aircraft in question was formally declared critically unsafe before 5 o'clock that afternoon, an emergency guarantee fund established years earlier by Everett Whitmore would automatically freeze and transfer to an independent asset overseer. That overseer, it turned out, maintained close ties to Sterling Ashford's investment fund, meaning the very safeguard her father had built to protect the company could be twisted into the mechanism that destroyed it. Every eye in the hangar turned to Vivian as the board effectively pressured her to sign away control before the deadline passed, several directors suggesting openly that she had inherited her father's name without inheriting his judgment. One director went further, remarking that perhaps the company would be better served by leadership more experienced in crisis, a remark aimed squarely at Vivian's age and her relatively short tenure at the helm. Preston Kingsley did not defend her, choosing instead to let the silence stretch long enough that everyone in the room understood exactly where his sympathies currently rested. It was a humiliation delivered in full view of her own staff, engineered specifically to make her feel as though she had no better option than surrender. Callan stood near the edge of the hangar, watching in silence until a member of security approached and asked him to leave the premises since his work order, as far as anyone could tell, had already been completed. Dalton glanced over and referred to him dismissively as the $1 mechanic, suggesting he had no business lingering near conversations that involved billions rather than the price of a coffee. Callan gathered his tools without complaint, prepared to walk back to his truck and put the entire strange morning behind him, until his eyes caught a printed authorization code buried inside the documents Dalton had spread across a folding table. The code matched, almost exactly, the identifier from a final test flight he had personally flown years earlier, a flight he had never expected to matter again. The very man being escorted out of the building was, without anyone in that room realizing it yet, the only person alive who understood what that authorization code truly meant, and the only one who could determine whether the $99 million guarantee was about to be stolen in broad daylight. As security guided him toward the exit, his equipment bag caught the edge of a folding table, and his worn leather wallet tumbled onto the concrete floor. Vivian bent down out of simple reflex to hand it back, but her eyes caught on a laminated card sitting half-exposed among the folded bills, a commercial pilot license alongside an aviation technician certification, both bearing a code she recognized from somewhere she could not immediately place. The identifier read CB7719A, and something about those characters made her breath catch in her throat. Marin Lockridge, standing close enough to see the card over Vivian's shoulder, went pale almost instantly because she recognized the code from an old appendix buried inside the paperwork governing the $99 million guarantee fund. According to a clause her father had written into that fund years earlier, only the individual holding that specific certification number had the authority to confirm whether damage to the aircraft was the result of genuine maintenance failure or deliberate interference. Dalton's composure cracked for the first time that day, and he immediately suggested the documents might be forged, insisting a man dressed like a laborer could not possibly be the aviator described in Everett Whitmore's private clause. Callan calmly retrieved a second card from the same wallet, an old access badge for Cedar Falls Aviation Yard, the very facility Dalton had claimed no longer existed in any usable form. Vivian asked why he had not mentioned any of this the moment he arrived, and Callan answered simply that he had learned a long time ago that wealthy people tend to believe a mechanic's word only after every other option has been exhausted. The hangar fell into an uncomfortable silence, engineers and board staff alike. Realizing that the man who had been handed $1 less than 2 hours earlier now held more technical authority over the company's future than anyone else standing in that room. It was in that silence that Vivian began, for the first time, to look at Callan the way her father might once have looked at him, with something closer to respect than suspicion. The shift was small, almost imperceptible, but it was the first crack in the wall she had built around every person she considered beneath her. Callan explained, in a voice stripped of self-pity, that years earlier he had worked as a technical transport pilot for Everett Whitmore himself, back when Callan was still young enough to believe that talent alone could protect a career. Everett had never behaved like the other executives Callan encountered, because he actually listened when Callan flagged a safety concern, even when that honesty slowed down deals worth enormous sums of money. During one particular test flight out of Cedar Falls, Everett had discovered that someone inside his own company was quietly altering internal records to obscure a looming financial risk, a discovery that frightened him enough to take extraordinary precautions. In response, Everett had personally established the $99 million guarantee fund, designed specifically to protect both his daughter and the company from any future attempt at a hostile takeover. The activation clause for that fund had been buried deep inside the aircraft's original certification data, and it required verification from the very last pilot to complete a certified test flight on that jet, a role that had belonged, quietly and almost accidentally, to Callan Brooks. Not long after that flight, Cedar Falls was shuttered entirely, and Callan found himself pushed out of the industry through a fabricated disciplinary record that destroyed his reputation and cost him every major contract he had built his career around. He remembered sitting across from a review panel that would not meet his eyes, listening to allegations he could not trace back to any real incident, watching years of careful work erased by paperwork he had never signed. Airlines that once competed for his availability stopped returning his calls within a matter of weeks, and the technical community that had respected him for his precision suddenly treated him like a liability no one wanted attached to their name. Without the resources to fight a legal battle against a company with unlimited funds, and unwilling to drag his young daughter into a war with powerful strangers, he simply walked away and rebuilt a smaller, quieter life around occasional maintenance work. He took jobs that asked little of his history and even less of his pride, fixing generators, servicing small charter planes, patching together whatever kept the lights on and food on the table for two. There were nights he sat in his truck outside a hangar much smaller than Cedar Falls, running his thumb over the edge of an old identification badge he no longer had any right to use. wondering whether the version of himself who once flew for Everett Whitmore had simply ceased to exist. He never once spoke of it publicly, choosing instead to raise his daughter, Lena, in relative peace far from the industry that had discarded him, telling her only that he used to fly airplanes for people who did not always deserve his trust. Vivian listened to the story with a mixture of shame and disbelief, slowly understanding that her father had once placed his complete trust in the very man she had humiliated with a $1 receipt only hours earlier. She realized, with a growing discomfort she could not shake, that Everett Whitmore had never chosen the most brilliant person available to protect his legacy, but rather the one honest enough to ask uncomfortable questions when it mattered most. Callan told her plainly that her father had not left the guarantee fund to the smartest person in any given room, but to whoever remained humble enough to ask the right question at the right moment. It was a quiet accusation, and Vivian felt every word of it land exactly where he intended. Dalton understood immediately that Callan represented an existential threat to everything he had spent months arranging, and he moved quickly to discredit him before anyone could dig deeper into the falsified logbook entries. Within minutes, old disciplinary paperwork appeared on the shared boardroom screen, framing Callan as a pilot who had once been suspended for violating fundamental safety procedures, a portrayal designed to erase every ounce of credibility he had just earned. Vivian felt her resolve wobble under the weight of official-looking documents, and Maren Lockridge quietly advised her not to gamble the company's future on a contractor with an apparent history of misconduct. Dalton pressed the advantage further, warning Vivian that if she trusted this stranger and turned out to be wrong, she would likely lose her position as chief executive before the day was finished. Rather than defending himself with lengthy explanations, Callan asked for something specific and verifiable, requesting access to a secondary data module hidden behind the aircraft's electronics bay. He explained that even if paper records had been falsified, the raw flight data stored in that module would still carry its original untouched timestamp, a detail nearly impossible to fake convincingly under pressure. Dalton objected violently, arguing that opening the module without authorization would void the manufacturer's warranty and expose the company to unnecessary legal liability. Vivian now stood at a genuine crossroads, forced to decide whether to trust the polished executive who had guided her through years of corporate decisions, or the quiet stranger she had known for barely an hour. In the end, she remembered something her father used to say whenever a decision felt impossibly complicated, that an aircraft never lies, only the person signing its paperwork does. With that thought steadying her, she gave Callan formal permission to open the data module, ignoring the visible tension rippling across Dalton's face. As Callan moved toward the electronics bay, Dalton quietly stepped away and sent a brief message from his phone, instructing an unseen contact to destroy the final backup copy before anyone could access it. Somewhere outside that hangar, a piece of evidence capable of unraveling the entire scheme was now in danger of disappearing before it could ever be seen. Callan opened the data module in full view of Vivian, Maren, the security team, and the directors still watching remotely from the boardroom screen, refusing to rush the process or perform for the audience gathered around him. He worked with deliberate patience, narrating each step in plain language so that no one in the room could later claim confusion about what the evidence showed. The recovered data revealed 3 critical facts that reshaped the entire situation in a matter of minutes. First, the mismatched component had been installed barely 2 days earlier, directly contradicting the official paperwork claiming it had been in service for half a year. Second, the authorization allowing that replacement had been issued using an internal access credential reserved exclusively for the Chief Operating Officer, meaning whoever approved the swap held Dalton's own level of clearance. Third, and most damning, the signature entered into the aircraft's official logbook under Callan's initials did not match the verified digital signature tied to his real pilot license and technician certification. Marin Lockridge began to understand the full implication almost immediately, recognizing that if the signature had been forged, then the entire safety report Dalton had used to trigger the emergency clause could be rendered legally void. The room seemed to hold its breath as the pieces locked into place around a conspiracy far larger than a single grounded jet. Vivienne turned to Dalton, her voice no longer carrying the sharp arrogance from earlier that morning, but something colder and far more precise. She asked him directly why his own access credential appeared attached to a safety failure his engineering team had supposedly discovered independently. Dalton attempted to deflect, suggesting his credentials might have been misused without his knowledge by someone else inside the company. Callan calmly pointed out one final detail that made the excuse impossible to sustain, explaining that the security system had also logged a biometric confirmation tied specifically to a scanner located inside Dalton's own private office. The room shifted from tense silence into something closer to disbelief, as employees who had spent years admiring Dalton's polish began to reconsider everything they thought they understood about him. Someone near the back of the hangar murmured that they had always found his charm a little too rehearsed, the kind of remark people only allow themselves once a man has already been caught. The man who had mocked Callan as a $1 laborer only hours earlier now stood exposed, layer by layer, in front of the very board he had hoped to manipulate. Preston Kingsley, arms crossed, watched the unraveling with the expression of a man recalculating every assumption he had made about both Vivienne and Dalton. Dalton tried one final maneuver, insisting that even if his credentials had been used, the underlying safety concern about the aircraft remained legitimate and should not be dismissed simply because of a procedural irregularity. Callan answered him without raising his voice, explaining that a genuine safety concern would have appeared consistently across every diagnostic system rather than only in the one report conveniently timed to trigger a financial clause. Marin Cross referenced the maintenance history one final time and confirmed that no other system on the aircraft, past or present, had ever flagged the failure Dalton claimed to have discovered. It was, for anyone watching, one of the most satisfying reversals the hangar had witnessed in years. Once the authentic flight data had been fully restored, an old encrypted file left behind by Everett Whitmore appeared among the recovered records, short, precise, and entirely free of sentimentality. In it, Everett explained plainly that if this particular file was ever accessed, it meant someone had attempted to misuse the very jet meant to safeguard his company's future. He confirmed, in unambiguous language, that Callan Brooks had served as the final certified test pilot for that aircraft and stood as an independent technical witness whose authority could not simply be overridden by internal politics. He further stated that if Callan's verified signature was ever found to be forged anywhere within the company's records, the transfer of the guarantee fund must be halted immediately and control returned in full to the sitting chief executive of Whitmore Global Aviation. The directors listening from the boardroom screen shifted visibly in their seats, several exchanging uneasy glances as the implications settled over them. Preston Kingsley asked Marin to read the relevant clause aloud a second time, wanting no ambiguity left in the record. Marin confirmed that under these newly verified conditions, Dalton not only lost any ability to trigger the fund's transfer, but had likely exposed himself to a formal internal investigation for orchestrating a scheme to seize company assets under false pretenses. Sterling Ashford, watching the entire collapse unfold over a video connection, tried to maintain an air of composure even as his advantage evaporated in real time. Sensing the ground shifting beneath him, Sterling proposed a quiet settlement, offering $20 million to resolve the dispute privately rather than allow it to escalate into a prolonged legal battle. For a brief moment, Vivian considered the offer, aware that the company badly needed liquidity after months of quiet financial strain, and aware too that a fast resolution would spare her the exhausting spectacle of a public legal fight. Marin reminded her that accepting money from Sterling now, however tempting, would likely be read later as an admission that the underlying claim on the fund had some legitimate basis after all. Callan spoke up then, reminding her gently that anyone willing to pay $20 million for silence was almost certainly afraid of what she stood to keep if she refused. Vivian looked directly into the camera and declined Sterling's offer in front of the entire board, her voice steady enough that no one in the room mistook it for hesitation. With Dalton's scheme fully exposed, Vivian instructed security to detain him quietly until an internal investigation team could formally take over, choosing restraint over spectacle. There was no need for shouting or dramatic confrontation, only the simple, deliberate act of security removing his access badge, his company phone, and the keys to his private office. Preston Kingsley, who had spent the entire morning questioning Vivian's fitness to lead, now announced publicly that the board would suspend any further votes against her leadership. Still, in his characteristically blunt manner, he asked her what she intended to do about the mechanic standing quietly near the hangar entrance. Vivian walked over to Callan and retrieved the folded $1 receipt he had accepted without complaint earlier that morning. In front of everyone, still gathered in the hangar, she tore it cleanly in half and offered him a genuine apology, not the hollow kind meant to smooth over an awkward moment, but the kind spoken by someone confronting, for the first time, how easily her position had let her mistreat another person. Callan did not accept empty flattery in return, telling her plainly that she did not owe him sympathy, only the truth about who had destroyed his career all those years earlier. Marin pulled the old disciplinary file and discovered that the signature recommending his suspension belonged to a former executive who had later become a private consultant working closely with Dalton. Vivian understood then that Callan had been a casualty of the same corrupt network that had spent years quietly embedding itself inside her company. She offered him a generous consulting fee, expecting the number itself to feel like sufficient closure. Callan turned down the inflated figure and asked instead for something far simpler, a formal public restoration of his professional record. He did not want to be bought. He wanted his name returned to him exactly as it had been before it was taken. Even with Dalton removed from the equation, Vivian still faced a serious problem, since she needed to reach New York before midnight to finalize the restructuring agreement that would protect the company from further instability. Her regular staff pilot refused to fly, citing understandable concern about lingering legal exposure following the data tampering scandal that had just consumed the entire morning. Callan performed one final inspection and confirmed the aircraft was safe to fly once the mismatched module had been properly replaced, yet no one else on the team was willing to accept responsibility for the flight. Vivian finally turned to him and asked, without pretense, whether he would be willing to fly it himself. Callan hesitated for a long moment, standing at the edge of a decision that carried far more weight than a simple flight schedule. Years of quiet exile from the industry, of feeling erased from a career he once loved, pressed against the opportunity now sitting directly in front of him. He stepped aside briefly and called his daughter Lena, telling her only that he might be home later than expected that evening. It was a small moment, brief and unremarkable on its surface, yet it carried the full weight of everything he had sacrificed to protect her from the world he was about to step back into. He put on a spare pilot's jacket kept in storage at the hangar and walked past the very staff members who had mocked him only hours earlier, his boots echoing across the polished concrete floor beneath the gleaming body of the jet. Vivienne walked a few steps behind him, and for the first time since they had met that morning, she was not giving an order. Before the aircraft could depart, Sterling Ashford sent one final message threatening legal action if Vivienne allowed an outside contractor to serve as pilot of record. Vivienne answered without flinching, telling him he was welcome to pursue any legal action he wished, because she intended to land with the truth firmly on her side. The jet lifted off the Nevada tarmac carrying a chief executive, a man who had been paid $1 that same morning, and a set of recovered data capable of dismantling a scheme worth nearly $100 million. Once they leveled off above the desert, Vivienne sat quietly across the cabin, watching Callan work the instruments with a fluency that made it obvious this had once been the most natural part of his life. She asked him, almost hesitantly, what it felt like to be back in a cockpit after so many years away from it. He told her it felt like remembering a language he had been forbidden to speak, familiar in every syllable but strange on his tongue after such a long silence. Somewhere behind them on the ground, employees who had spent the morning watching Callan with quiet contempt now stood watching the aircraft climb into a clear afternoon sky. The man once considered unworthy of even standing inside that hangar was now the reason the entire Whitmore empire had any chance of surviving the day intact. Vivienne and Callan landed in New York with time to spare, arriving at the upper floors of the Whitmore corporate tower where Sterling Ashford and his attorneys were already waiting, confident that Vivienne carried nothing more than a technical footnote unlikely to withstand serious legal scrutiny. Callan delivered the final piece of the puzzle during the meeting itself, revealing that the forged authorization code discovered earlier that day did not exist in isolation, but appeared across 3 additional asset records belonging to Whitmore Global Aviation. This meant the falsified maintenance history was never an isolated failure, but part of a coordinated effort to quietly erode the value of the company's entire aircraft fleet over an extended period of time. Marin Lockridge presented a full analysis to the assembled directors, explaining that if Sterling continued pressing for the acquisition under these circumstances, his fund could reasonably be viewed as a direct beneficiary of the underlying fraud. Preston Kingsley's posture changed almost immediately, and he demanded an independent investigation begin at once, along with an immediate freeze on any further negotiations involving Sterling Ashford's fund. Sterling attempted a dismissive laugh, remarking that Callan was, after all, merely a mechanic with no real standing in a room full of executives. Vivienne cut him off without hesitation, telling him plainly that Callan was the only person in that room who had read the truth before anyone else had a chance to sell it away. With the conspiracy fully exposed and the board firmly behind her, Vivienne formally activated the clause her father had written years earlier, using the guarantee fund exactly as he had intended, to stabilize the company rather than dismantle it. Dalton Blackwood was permanently removed from every position he held within the organization, and the legal team began preparing formal proceedings against everyone connected to the scheme, including elements of Sterling Ashford's own fund. Alongside these corporate actions, Vivienne ensured that Callan's professional reputation was restored publicly and without reservation, a promise she intended to keep in full regardless of what it cost the company politically. What had begun as an attempt to strip away a father's protective legacy ended instead with that same legacy protecting the daughter it was always meant for. Several weeks later, Whitmore Global Aviation held a public briefing to formally close out the internal investigation that had consumed the company since that chaotic morning in the desert. Vivienne announced that Dalton Blackwood had been permanently separated from the organization, that the proposed transfer to Sterling Ashford's fund had been fully canceled, and that the guarantee fund her father created had ultimately served exactly the purpose he intended from the very beginning. More significant to those who had followed the story closely, Vivienne used part of that briefing to issue a direct public apology to Callan Brooks, acknowledging the harm caused by the fabricated disciplinary record that had once ended his career. His professional standing was formally reinstated across the industry. The old allegations were quietly and permanently withdrawn, and his name returned to the aviation registry as a certified pilot and technician free of any lingering suspicion. Colleagues who had once avoided mentioning his name in professional circles now spoke of him with the kind of respect that came far too late but mattered all the same. Vivienne personally offered him the newly created role of Director of Flight Safety for Whitmore Global Aviation, a position with real authority and real weight inside the company he had once been ordered to leave through a side entrance. Callan did not accept the offer immediately, telling her honestly that he needed time to speak with his daughter first, since he was no longer willing to trade his family's stability for professional recognition, no matter how well earned it might be. Vivienne respected the answer without pressing him further, understanding, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to value something more than ambition. The final scene unfolded quietly back at the original hangar, where Callan stood alone beside the very aircraft that had upended his life for one long, unforgettable day. He was no longer the man dismissed with a single dollar and a condescending glance, and everyone who had witnessed that morning knew it. Vivienne approached and handed him an envelope, and inside was not a flashy check meant for cameras, but a formal contract whose opening line read simply that Callan Brooks would serve as an independent authority, not as hired help. Callan allowed himself a small, quiet smile at the wording, understanding exactly what she had chosen to say and why she had chosen to say it that way. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the torn halves of the $1 receipt Vivienne had ripped apart in front of the board weeks earlier, tucking them neatly inside the folder as a private reminder of where the entire story had started. Some people had looked at him that morning and seen nothing more than grease-stained hands and a tired old truck parked among expensive cars. But the aircraft, the data hidden inside it, and the truth waiting patiently to be uncovered had always seen something else entirely. Lena met him at the hangar entrance later that afternoon, curious enough about her father's sudden reappearance in the aviation world to ask if she could see the jet that had caused so much trouble. Callan walked her slowly around the aircraft, pointing out the panel he had opened that first morning, the spot where a false part had nearly cost a company everything it was worth. She asked him, with the plain honesty only a teenager could manage, whether he was going to take the new position or keep fixing generators for people who never bothered to learn his name. He told her the decision was not really his alone to make anymore, and that, whatever he chose next, he wanted her opinion sitting somewhere close to the center of it, since she had lived through every hard year that decision would eventually be built on top of. Vivienne watched the two of them from a distance, struck by how easily Callan set aside the weight of the morning to be simply present with his daughter, a kind of steadiness she suspected her own father had once carried, and that she was only now beginning to understand in herself. She thought about the version of herself who had handed him a single dollar without a second thought, and how far that version felt from the woman standing in the hangar now. Whatever Callan ultimately decided about the position, she resolved that Whitmore Global Aviation would carry her father's original intention forward, protecting the people who told the truth even when it cost them everything to do so. It felt, to her, like the only inheritance worth keeping, far more valuable than any figure ever written on a balance sheet. Vivienne had hired him that morning believing she was simply paying a stranger to repair a broken private jet. By the time the story reached its end, Callan Brooks had done something far greater than fix an aircraft. He had quietly repaired the very empire her father had spent a lifetime building and handed it back to her whole.